6:36, Nashville's morning news on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Welcome on into your Thursday, September 5th. Hope you're doing well, along with Joan Jones and Johnny B. Dan Mandis here, along with EJ Haust, who joins us on the Newsmaker Hotline. EJ, always great to have you on. So there is how many complete train wrecks can Tim Walz be involved in? So now, apparently, although I don't know if this is an old story or not, the headline, though, is that Tim Walz is accused of massive pandemic funds fraud, and now he's been subpoenaed, or documents and so forth have been subpoenaed by the U.S. Workforce Committee. And apparently, this is related to a fraud scheme where they misused pandemic relief funds meant for children. I mean, this could get really ugly. So, I mean, you, as people no doubt know by now, they've listened hopefully every day, and they've heard me talk about how you lived under the Walz regime for quite some time. You've done some digging. What have you found out about this?
Okay, so you're right. It's not a new thing. We've actually, anybody paying attention and unhappy with Walz's regime running in Minnesota for many years have been talking about this. This is the largest COVID related fraud scandal in the nation. It's a $250 million fraud scam. Okay. And not one person under the Walz administration has been held accountable for it. And I think that's the headline that everybody seems to be missing. It's not just that, he was, overseeing the Department of Education and the things that went along with it. No one has been held accountable from within the administration. In fact, Walz said, well, no one's been indicted. Well, the people who would do the indicting are all on Team Walz. So who's going to do that, right? But let me give you a quick recap of what Feeding Our Future is and how the scam works. So in Minnesota, the Minnesota Department of Education administers the Federal Child Nutrition Program. Federal Child Nutrition Program comes from the USDA. You can hear Tom Vilsack in that. He heads that department just like he did when Obama was president. And the meals are funded to children by way of what they call sites. So usually it's a school. Think school lunch programs, after school snacks, before preschool breakfast, things like that. But during the pandemic, however, U.S. Department of Agriculture waived a lot of the requirements for participation in that program. So instead of just being schools and other things that had easy direct oversight by, say, the Minnesota Department of Education, they were allowing all kinds of different sites, like for-profit restaurants, off-site food distribution centers, autism centers, random businesses, all kinds of things could apply for the reimbursement program. So if they served a meal, they would get reimbursed by the Minnesota Department of Education. Department of Education received these funds from the USDA. If all of that kind of makes sense, I know it's a quick one. But each site participating in the program is supposed to be sponsored during this kind of weird pandemic state, was supposed to be sponsored by an authorized sponsoring organization. Feeding Our Futures was sponsored by the Minnesota Department of Education and should have been responsible for oversight of that. So they're also responsible for filling out, the paperwork, submitting all of the claims and things like that, even reporting the names of the children who received the meals. So Minnesota Department of Education under Tim Walz was supposed to be the one in charge of making sure all these sites were operating properly, right? Audits, whatever. More than 250 sites popped up around the state of Minnesota. Huge. I mean, this is such a big thing.
Yeah.
And Feeding Our Future went from about 3.4 million in federal funding in 2019 for these kinds of programs to almost 200 million by 2021.
Wow.
So clearly it was a huge jump. Everybody was saying, okay, it's pandemic, but these sites were like random addresses, friends of friends, family members. In one case, this woman, she's one of the defendants, There's a massive, there's cases, indictments, everything all over the place with this. Her name is Ayan Abukar. Apologies, I'm going to botch some of the names in this. But she is one of the defendants. She ran a scandal, and also another charity organization called Action for East African People, and sent more than 1.6 million to companies that were owned by her family. That woman was presented by Tim Walz the award for Outstanding Refugee in July 2021.
I'm sorry. This is so funny. I actually snorted. I don't know if you heard that, EJ. I apologize.
Yep. It's wild. I mean, it's wild. And there's a huge other headline, too, if I can get to it, because it's, in my opinion, it's the most important part.
Okay.
Walz admitted to the Minnesota Reformer, local news kind of organization, that he knew of the suspicious activity as early as November 2020, when Minnesota Department of Education first started to raise a few concerns and say, hey, maybe this is a bit much. But Walz allowed the payments to continue. So you have to assume that this woman, Ayan Abukar, who received the award as part of her vetting process, right, would have had Feeding Our Future and this whole scandal on her resume. But Walz told media outlets that he tried to stop the fraud in April 2021. In 2021, a judge actually, Walz tried to blame it on this judge and saying, no, it was a court order. We had to continue the payments. The judge, and this never happens, came out with a public statement that said, absolutely not. Walz was incorrect. There's no court order to continue these payments. So Walz knew about the scandal. He allowed the payments to continue and even gave one of the defendants an award.
I'm reading some of the things here. Folks that worked for this charity, I mean, they bought big fancy cars. They bought real estate holdings in Kenya and some other places. I mean, here's, I guess, my question. Clearly, in my opinion, Tim Walz is incompetent. My question is he incompetent and corrupt, or is he just incredibly incompetent and his incompetence is so there that it just looks corrupt?
Yeah, I think he's a puppet. I've said this in your program before. I do think there's corruption involved. I do think it's a massive amount of incompetence, right? I mean, really, if you think about it, the people in the machine that, want to take over and want to really make sure that Trump doesn't get elected, they're competent and they tell Walz what to do. But when Walz goes rogue, he comes off as incredibly dumb, just not all that smart, right? He's not the sharpest tack in the drawer, that's for sure.
So EJ, from what I understand in reading about his financial situation, for a guy who, again, did spend some years in Congress, he was a teacher as well. I think he had a pension or something from one of the jobs that he had, but people were struck by the fact that for a man who had some means, he didn't have any IRAs or anything in his financial disclosures. I mean, to the point where people are just saying, this is just weird.
I agree. I think it's very strange. He's very secretive, clearly, about that. But I also think, he's got a wife and he's got kids. Have we done the vetting on Gwen's investments? It could all be in her name, right? So before we make too many judgments on that, I'm not going to speak on something I don't know much about. I will say, however, regardless of where he spends his own money or saves his own money, he sure as heck likes to spend everybody else's.
Yes.
They had a surplus of a lot of money. I think it was like $20 billion. I apologize if I get that number wrong, but it was a massive surplus. He blew through it, raised taxes, and spent like 3 times that much in one term. So, it's not that he doesn't know how to spend it. That's for sure.
So the headline, Tim Walz hit with a House subpoena for the $250 million. We don't know if any of that money was kicked back to him. But maybe if there is some sort of an investigation, they'll figure out exactly by following the money what happened. Now, do you think that this is something that they'll actually follow through with, and the in the House, because House investigations, they go on forever, and oftentimes, especially if Republicans are in charge, they never really go anywhere and accomplish nothing.
They really very rarely accomplish anything other than, headlines and fundraising email opportunities. But in this case, I'm hoping that it brings to light for the whole nation what really is going on here. I mean, it's going to be hard to hide 70 indictments so far. 5 people have been convicted at trial. 18 have pled guilty. There's more trials coming in 2025. I mean, it gets weirder and weirder. There was the bribery of a juror in one of the original cases, and there's two guilty pleas on that case. So, I mean, it's absolutely maddening. But what I hope kind of comes out of this is not just his incredible mismanagement and hubris. I mean, and this is just a brazen $250 million of taxpayer money. And it's nationwide taxpayer money, remember, because it came from the USDA.
Yep.
But more importantly, maybe African-American school kids in Mississippi read and do math at a higher level than those students in Minnesota, than all students in Minnesota. So through all of this, yes, he likes to tout how he wants to feed kids and everything else. He can't educate them. So Mr. As a teacher, every time that comes out of his mouth, I feel like I'm playing the buzzword bingo game. Forget it. He can't educate kids. And he did a really, really terrible job with the Minnesota Department of Education. That should be what everybody needs to know about the whole thing. There's a scam. There's a scandal, $250 million stolen of taxpayer money. This guy was in charge, and not one person has been fired. In fact, when he was asked about it and others were asked about it, they blew it off and said, that's not what we're all about. We're here to educate and feed kids.
Well,
okay.
Yeah. And think about the Biden administration. I mean, very, very rarely is anybody held accountable for stuff that happens there either. I mean, you can talk about any number of things, the wide open border, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let me ask you, and I've only got like a minute, but the more of these things that pile up, and there's a lot, and I'm reading a lot of these political insiders who are saying that Walz, because of all of the stolen valor and all these other things that he is accused of doing and has done, do you think it's possible that he may step aside or step down, or they may ask him to step aside or step down? Because I believe that Kamala Harris has plateaued, and now people are really watching.
I don't think so. I don't think they'll do that until after the election. Should she win, he might step down a year into the term or something like that. I don't think they can at this point. It's too late. But I do think we are going to get other scandals. Some of it could be really outrageous. There's lots of people pontificating out there and suggesting that perhaps Joe Biden steps down so that she can be an incumbent president. That would make headlines like crazy for a couple of weeks. There's other conspiracy theories out there. And at this stage in the game, I don't think anything is too crazy to expect, right? We should just be ready for it. There will be something crazy that happens between now and November. I think there's the possibility that, this trial, or the sentencing with Donald Trump could be the big scandal that we all talk about here in a couple of weeks. So I think there will be more headlines to come. I think it's too late for Walz to be removed from the ticket unless he has some sort of a health scandal of his own. But he seems to be in pretty good health, bouncing around the stages. As
he sure does bounce, doesn't he? We'll move right along. All right, EJ, how can people find you on Twitter?
Yeah, for sure. Go to X and do a search for capital E, capital J with a little happy face emoji, or you can look at ERINHAUST